Hey everyone, this is George and I'm back with a new video. In this video, we're going to discuss who should be Spider-Man in any forthcoming Sony Spider-Man films. The funny thing is that this video was inspired by the passionate comment section responses from my Venom 2 speculation videos. There was Team Maguire, Team Garfield, and of course Team Holland. Each group was extremely cutthroat and ready to throw down for their respective Spider-Man. It was kind of impressive, but I'm actually going to expand the choices with 3 more. So let's discuss who should be Spider-Man in the Sony SpiderVerse. First up is Toby Maguire of the Raimi Spider-Man films, aka Raimi Spider-Man. I honestly thought Maguire's Spider-Man would not have as much support as he did, but Maguire still has a ton of fans and they want him back in the red and blue spandex. I love Maguire and the Raimi films, but at first I really thought this was a long shot at best. But then the more I thought about it, yeah, it is possible to see him coming back, but I actually don't think that he should. So Maguire has the distinction of starring in 3 solo feature films with no special appearances, just his own star power. That's right, no Cap, no Iron Man, no Thor appearances. Yes, there's a Tom Jane Punisher appearance, but that was a blink and you miss it cameo. Toby Maguire was the Spider-Man for a world of fans from the early 2000s and onward. He starred in his trilogy of films and they were global phenomenons and nearly starred in a 4th film before it was scrapped. And looking at his current photos on Google search, he definitely looks like with a little training, he could probably squeeze back into the costume if he was willing to return. So I can definitely see it happening. As a fan of this version of Spider-Man, I wouldn't hate to see him reprise the role, but Maguire's Spider-Man has at least had the completion of his film trilogy, and I just think there's another film version of Spider-Man that should appear in the Sony Spider-Verse films. I also think executives at Sony and probably producer Amy Pascal probably wouldn't want Maguire to return. Maguire was actually nearly replaced after the first Spider-Man by Jake Gyllenhaal, yes, Donnie Darko, aka Mysterio, in the upcoming Spider-Man Far From Home movie, because of, well, whichever source you believe is either because of back injuries that he sustained or for trying to negotiate a raise. Either way, Sony and company were ready to walk, so we very nearly got Donnie Darko as his replacement. Thankfully, Maguire dug deep and managed to convince them to give him his job back. Some recently surfaced information even shows that Maguire was actually considered for a role in the Into the Spider-Verse film. In an interview with one of the directors, he was asked if Maguire was ever considered for a role, and he actually said yes. He was considered, but they chose not to go through with the casting because they didn't want to confuse fans. I'm actually not sure how to take this because it's literally a movie about spider heroes from alternate universes and has at least 2 Peter Parker characters who appear and are very similar to each other, and there wasn't any confusion, I don't think. So if this isn't a superficial response just to dismiss the question, what he may have meant is that they want to avoid people confusing Into the Spider-Verse as a continuation of the Raimi Spider-Man films, which to me makes more sense, but in a film about alternate universes, we know the Raimi Spider-Man exists out there somewhere. There's also been talk of bringing Maguire in as Uncle Ben for the MCU Spider-Man films, which could be cool, but seeing as how it would be a flashback scene, it would probably need to be a very significant scene for Maguire to want to even do something like that. Even if Maguire and Raimi were pushing for the return of their Sony Spider-Man, well, there's the issue of Venom, and I think this could actually be confusing for audiences. See, Maguire's Spider-Man has already faced off against his own version of Venom, aka Topher Grace Venom. Right now, Sony and Pascal's baby is Tom Hardy's Venom franchise, and rightly so because it's earned over $850 million globally. So bringing in Maguire's Spider-Man could potentially be jarring if a lot of fans recall the Topher Grace Venom. I think overall there is red tape that Sony will most likely not want to deal with if Maguire were to return. And as much as I love Maguire's Spider-Man, I don't think that he'll be reprising the live action role again, but I could be wrong. Another possibility is that maybe Sony decides to cast an unknown and just start from scratch. Now, this isn't a bad option, but I also think fans don't really want this and would like to see the current or a previous Spider-Man in the role. But if it is done, it's a clean slate and we'll have to judge everything based on the character's introduction into the Venom films. That does raise the question of whether or not Sony will want to do an origin story or not, and also if fans will accept this version of a Spider-Man knowing that Holland's Spider-Man exists in the MCU, or that they could have possibly returned Maguire or Garfield to the role. And if the new casting is not well received, and if the film comes out and fans don't warm up to a new Spider-Man, well, it could potentially cause a lot of problems for Sony. On the reverse, what if this Spider-Man is insanely popular and actually rivals Holland's Spider-Man? How would Disney Marvel feel about that? Personally, I would prefer if this were not to happen, but I can see why Sony could just want someone completely new in the role and not have any extra baggage. There's also the actual possibility of two of the Spider-Man actors, the ones from Into the SpiderVerse, very potentially jumping into the live action versions of their characters. I'm actually referring to Shameik Moore, aka Miles Morales Spider-Man, and Jake Johnson, aka Hobo Spider-Man. We're introduced to these versions of Spider-Man in the Into the Spider-Verse film, whose animated avatars were made to look like their real-life selves. While I don't think they would both appear in the Venom universe or Sony Cinematic Universe, Johnson's Spider-Man is closer in age to Tom Hardy. Unfortunately, Johnson's career has had a lot of lovable loser-type roles, and so I don't think we've ever seen him in a demanding role, so it's really hard for me to determine if he would be able or even willing to meet the physical demands of playing the character in live action. I feel Shameik Moore could transition better into the live action role, but I don't feel like his Spider-Man would be a good fit with Hardy's much older Eddie Brock. There isn't a whole lot of precedent in the comics, I think, of Eddie Brock's Venom and Miles Morales' Spider-Man interacting, so this would be new ground for the characters, but that isn't too big of a problem because Sony decided to introduce a Venom with no connection to Peter Parker's Spider-Man, so I don't feel like this is some impossible problem to solve. I am a fan of Miles Morales' Ultimate Spider-Man, but I think the age difference between Hardy and Moore would just kind of make it odd for me. But other than that, I think this could be a better fit than crossing Holland's Spider-Man from the MCU into the Sony Spider-Verse. What would actually be most interesting about incorporating either of these actors or both as Spider-Man is seeing them rotate from live action to CG characters for numerous films, and if the films would ever connect, this outcome would also leave open the possibility of Tom Hardy's Venom joining the animated Spider-Verse, which would also be pretty cool. Now for Tom Holland, aka MCU Spider-Man, and the current live action Spider-Man. He's actually going to appear in two 2019 films, Avengers Endgame and Spider-Man Far From Home. Both of these are Marvel Studios releases. Based on the comments I read, Tom Holland has enormous support, but there's some contrasting views on whether or not he should appear in Venom 2 or even the Sony Spider-Verse at all for that matter. Personally, I love Holland, but I don't want him to be in the Sony Spider-Verse, and I don't think the heads at Marvel Studios want this either. I think this is mostly because they have and want to maintain creative control of their version of Spider-Man, which is something I completely agree with. We've seen some fantastic character development over the course of 3 films, and we're actually going to get 2 more this year. Marvel Studios has done right by the character so far, and I think most likely they're going to continue to do so. Kevin Feige has a plan for Holland's Spider-Man, and it doesn't seem like that includes a Sony crossover. Of course, a Sony crossover is the most likely outcome as things stand now. We've heard Amy Pascal, the producer in the Sony Spider-Man films, express interest in not only crafting films around characters in the Spider-Man universe, that's how we got the Venom film in the first place, and even bringing over Holland's Spider-Man to star as Spider-Man in these films. Sony also owns the film rights to the character, so regardless of the agreement they currently have in place with Marvel Studios, in the near future they will be renegotiating, And if they can't reach an agreement, or if Disney doesn't just outright buy the film rights back, then Sony will have complete creative control over Spider-Man. On a side note, something very interesting that could happen once the Disney Fox deal is completed is that maybe Disney offers to sell/trade recently acquired Fox film assets such as, say, Aliens, Predator, Die Hard, Planet of the Apes, X-Files, maybe more. The reason this could possibly happen is because these are all lucrative franchises for mature audiences, but anyone who knows anything about Disney knows that they only really make family-friendly films. And there's been rumor that maybe Fox will kind of survive there, but I honestly think that their forthcoming streaming service will probably keep primarily to their family-friendly content model. So what could Disney do with these valuable properties that they may not touch for a long time? Well, they could sell or trade them. And by trade, I mean Disney could offer to sell numerous properties like Aliens to Sony at a certain price in exchange for Sony selling the Spider-Man property at a certain price to them. I honestly think Spider-Man is much more valuable to Disney for them to just own it outright, and I feel the Aliens and Predator and other properties could be more valuable to Sony. The reason I wouldn't feel too bad about Sony having properties like Aliens and Predator is also because Sony is willing to make R-rated films, and in my opinion would be more likely to allow R-rated content than Disney would. This could potentially be a win-win situation for fans and studios. So what does this mean for Spider-Man? Well, unless Marvel Studios and Sony come to a renewed agreement, or if Marvel doesn't somehow reacquire the film rights, then Spider-Man will inevitably return to Sony, and more than likely they will be pushing Tom Holland into their cinematic universe. And the last person on my list is Andrew Garfield and his amazing Spider-Man cinematic universe. I was surprised by how much support Garfield has when considering how much people either hated or just didn't care for the Amazing Spider-Man films. And while I liked Garfield a lot and I did enjoy his films, I do see and understand the criticisms that were made against his particular cinematic universe. With that being said, I personally feel that Andrew is the best choice for Sony's Spidey Venomverse. I actually made a previous video kind of discussing this, but for the sake of this video, I'm gonna go ahead and just talk about it. So why is Andrew my choice? Well, my main reason is that he's still in a very good age range to play Peter Parker, especially opposite Tom Hardy's Venom. Also, Garfield's Spider-Man only had 2 films and they never introduced Venom. And since Venom's origin has been changed from the Sony film, meaning Venom was never part of Spider-Man, well, this would not be an issue for Garfield's Spider-Man. When I watched Venom, I literally felt like it was set in Garfield's Sony Cinematic Spider-Verse. And this could have been just because it's a Sony film and they just wanted a similar kind of aesthetic look. Or this could have been intentional to leave it open and easier for Garfield to potentially reprise the role and to have Garfield's Spider-Man and Hardy's Venom cross paths. Also, Garfield's Spider-Man was the darkest of all of the live action incarnations of Spider-Man, which would actually be good for him joining Venom, who is generally a darker character. Based on the after credits scenes in Venom, we know they are planning to bring in Carnage, who is an extremely dark character, and so I think Garfield's Spider-Man would be just a good fit for any potential dark storylines like, say, Maximum Carnage or Kraven's Last Hunt. This would also bypass the need for an origin story if Sony established that this was a continuation of the Amazing Spider-Man films, and they're still recent enough that I think many people will still remember them. Of course, as much as myself and many others would like for this to happen, it's still a long shot at best. I say this because Sony and Garfield had a very public falling out, and while Garfield has been amiable when asked about Sony, well, you can tell there's still a lot of hurt there. So even if Sony was full steam ahead with trying to bring Garfield back into the fold, well, he may not want to return. Amy Pascal and the other Sony executives may even be dead set on just bringing back Holland over from the MCU. She's expressed this in interviews, and I think he is her first choice. But for me, Garfield, I think, is the best fit for Sony going forward, and I hope they've at least considered the possibility of bringing him back, because there are a lot of fans who would love this, including myself. Whatever happens, we'll actually know soon enough what Sony has planned, because Venom 2 is coming soon. If you look on imdb.com, it shows Venom 2's release date as October 2nd, 2020, so this film will be going into production very soon and may even be in pre-production mode right now. If the studio is serious about bringing Spider-Man into the Venom Cinematic Universe, odds are they will make it known in Venom 2. So until we hear a major announcement, this is probably going to be my last video on this specific topic. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that whoever is selected as the Sony Spider-Man is well received. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, share it if you loved it, and subscribe if you want more comic book content. And as always, thank you so much for watching.